Ahoy there! While working on Super Factory Manager, I've encountered two interesting bugs that I'd like to show you. The first one is the one that most people have actually been experiencing, and it's where the manager will continue to output items to an inventory even after it has been broken. And I have a test that is meant to replicate this behavior, but interestingly, it doesn't always fail like it would when the behavior is present. So what the test does is it places the inventories, and then it has the manager run a program to move one item from A to B, and the test will fail if the items are moved and they don't actually arrive as expected. So if we have a label gun, we can observe the labels in the different positions, and when the tests are run, it places invisible barrier blocks. So I have a command to remove those. So we're on 1.21.1, and we see that there is dirt inside this inventory, and it's moving to the other side, even though that block has been broken. So the items are effectively being voided. And the other notable behavior is that you can click the button in the manager to rebuild, and it will stop the movement. And when we place the inventory back, it's going to continue to receive the items. But interestingly, if we break the right block again, it's going to stop. So what I can do to make it stop working again is if I run this other test, and then I place the inventory back, and then I break it, it's not showing the behavior again, like I thought it would. So if we run the test again, it'll remove the left block, and then it'll remove the right block, and it'll see if the items keep going out. And then, so now the test passed, which means it's doing the correct thing. But if I punch out that barrel, then it's still not failing. So what we can do, if I run this one again, it might affect it. So now the items are staying. I place the inventory. And you know what, let's run this one again. So the items are moving from left to right, and if I punch out the right one, the items are still flowing. And if I restore it, the items are not going into it until we hit the rebuild button. So now the items are moving correctly. So this behavior, which does not happen on 1.19.2, is because of the way the capabilities are being collected. So when we have these cables, they form a cable network, and you can place multiple managers on the same cables so that they can share all the inventories that are connected, as long as you push the labels to them. So if we have all these things labeled storage and chest, we can push that to a different manager if we want. Oops. So if we have a copy of the disk, then we put that in a different manager, it will have the same labels. So they can access the same things, which means when we ask for the capability of this chest from any given direction, it's not being cached inside either manager, it's being cached inside a object that represents the entire cable network so that they don't have to do duplicate work, which means it's very efficient when you have multiple managers sharing the same cable network. So when we're caching these capabilities, we have a lookup for the positions of each of the cables. We can actually look at the code. Looking at the code, we can find the cable network class has the level and the set of cable positions, which we can store as a long for efficiency. And we have the block capability cache for level, which is a different class. So that stores a lookup map to a lookup map to a lookup map, where the first key is the position, and then the capability, and then the direction, and then the actual inner result. So when we're storing the capability here, that's because Super Factory Manager supports different resource types. So if we look at fluid and other resource types, then, oh, I thought I fixed the scroll bar, but I guess not. That's annoying. Can't click and drag it. All right, so we have forge energy, chemicals, fluids, gases, and slurries. So that is this key here is the type of capability that's being looked at. And then the direction, which can be null, and then the actual result. And on 1.19.2, this result is a lazy optional. But in newer versions, after 1.20.3, we look at the capability cache for the level, the comment still says lazy optional, but really this is storing a block capability result, and that has a raw capability, whereas if we look at cap results over here, this is storing a lazy optional. Instead of, on the newer versions, we're storing a direct reference to the capability object. So when we have this lazy optional, it has invalidation logic where it can be marked as invalid and everything that's using it needs to acknowledge that. So if we say is present, then in this case, we're just calling inner.isPresent. And when we get this from the level, so when we're doing discovery, and we're getting the capabilities from the network, the first thing we do, so this is a function that takes a given cable network, the type of capability we're looking for, and a position, and then the direction, which can be null, and we're going to try and return a capability result. And this capability result can be empty, so the empty variant is just an empty lazy optional. So the first thing we do is we check the cache. So we get the capability cache from the level, so that's just a getter. And then we have a helper function to discover if it's present in the cache. And if it's present there, then we'll return it. Otherwise, if it's not in the cache, we have to discover it from the level. So we want to make sure that we're only allowing wired connections. So if the position we're looking for is not adjacent to a cable position, as we have the list of all the positions in the cable network, then it's going to be an empty result. And if we're not on the server, then it's also going to be an empty result. When we discover the capability from the level, if there actually is a result, then we're going to track it inside the cache. So when we put the capability into the cache, we are also going to add a listener for when that capability becomes invalidated to remove it from the cache so that it won't be returned when it shouldn't be. And this part is what is going wrong, is when we punch out the block and the items keep moving, is because the manager is asking for the block that's over here and the block that's over here, and then it's moving items between them. But if the block that's over here has been destroyed, but the cache hasn't acknowledged that it's been destroyed, it's going to keep sending items to a thing that's no longer bound to the world, which means the items are going where they can't be retrieved anymore. And the correct behavior is that when the block is destroyed, the cache entry is removed, and when the block comes back, a new cache entry is present, which means it can move items to the new location. Whereas before, when it's not invalidated, even when we place a new block, the cache still has the old entry, so it's not going to use the new block, and it's going to keep sending over to the old one. So to fix that, the problem, as we identified, is that the invalidation listener was not running. And if we look at what actually happens when you add the invalidation listener on 1.19.2, we are calling add listener on the inner object, which on 1.19.2 is a lazy optional. So the lazy optional is provided by the Forge platform, where they provide this object and we register our invalidation listener with it. And then when that runs, it will remove the cache entry. And if we look at the 1.20.3 version, when we are discovering the capability from the network and we're tracking it into the cache, we call put capability into the cache, and as we do so, we are creating a listener and adding the invalidation listener to the capability, and we're registering it with the level. So this capability result, as of 1.20.3, no longer holds a lazy optional, but instead holds a direct reference to the object that is the capability. And now we're tracking our own listener, and we have to hold the listener even though we pass it to the level. So when we call server level.register capability listener, we're passing in the same object, a reference to the same object. And when we register the capability listener here, it's going into a capability listener holder, which stores lookup dictionaries for the list of them, but it also has a clean method, and the clean method will remove entries that have been garbage collected. So if we have a block that has a capability and a listener that's listening for it to be invalidated, and then that block goes away, then we want to remove that listener from the list of everything so that we're not wasting cycles doing useless work. So this clean method will remove everything that's not garbage, that's not pointed to with a strong reference. And what was previously happening in Superfactory Manager is that in the transition to 1.20.3, the capability result stopped holding a reference to the listener. This field was not present, which means that it only had the weak reference inside the listener holder, which means that it's getting removed before it's ran. So in this demonstration, I have, so this is 1.21.1.21.1, and inside the code for that, that's 1.20.3, this one, I have commented out the fix. So if I restore this, so that when we actually add the invalidation listener to the capability, in addition to registering it to the server level, we're now holding a reference to it, which would fix the behavior where it stops working. So if I run it, if I go back to the code, hit the reload button, and then run the test, it will always succeed now because we've corrected the improper behavior. And the reason that running this test had an effect on this one is because this test creates a huge amount of objects, which means that when we run the test and all those objects are taken away, it's doing a lot of stuff, which means that it is incentivizing the reference to be garbage collected. So when we have the block here and the capability is stored in the cache, and it has a listener to remove itself from the cable network when it's punched out, and then we cause the listener to be garbage collected, and then we punch it out, the items would keep flowing because it was not being removed from the cache. So that is how that was fixed. And then, because this is a severe bug where your items are getting lost and it's very frustrating for players, even though there's ways to manually fix it, no one wants to be doing that when you don't have to. So to release this, of course, we want all of the tests to pass. But the problem is that there was a different thing that started going wrong as I was trying to prepare this release. So we can observe all the tests, which is doing a variety of things to ensure the correct behavior, even when I'm changing the internals of the mod. There is a bug with the printing press that was causing problems because when we run just that failed test, it's now working. So when it was failing before, it was giving us issues, but now when we're running this test, it's succeeding. So that's very strange. So if I run all of them instead of clearing them all and then running just the failed one, we should be able to replicate that it's failing again. So here, it failed. But if I run it again, it succeeds. So the behavior on when this test fails and succeeds is very strange. So what's supposed to happen is that when the anvil lands on the enchanted book or the an item, it can turn it into a form to be used with the printing press. But sometimes what happens is the item becomes a ghost item and can't be picked up by players. So when we look at what's happening inside the test, let's see if I can. So as a cheat, I've already identified the problem that's happening, and I can reproduce it by doing it this way. So you'll notice that if I'm in a different chunk than when the item is, it fails. But if I'm in the same chunk, it succeeds. Let's so fail, succeed, fail, succeed. So for some reason, my presence in that chunk causes it to act differently. And usually when the test runs, it's supposed to destroy all the extra items. But in this case, they're just floating around and they cannot be picked up. But they do respond to kill. So we can kill the entities. They exist on the server, but we can't pick them up. It's not like they're just client-side entities. The other thing is that when they're on the ground and we leave and come back, they disappear. So what's happening in this case, we'll also notice that if we have 2 of the tests inside that chunk, when ran individually, they will fail. But if we run them together, they succeed. So from this, we can conclude that it's related to the number of entities in the chunk, or at least not being alone. So when we run one at a time, fails. But together, they succeed. So to fix that was a very interesting thing, which I will cut to the end of. So the way that works is there's a falling Anvil handler. So when an entity leaves the level, as long as we're on the server, we're going to do our logic, and we make sure that the entity that just left was a falling block entity, and the block that was falling is an anvil. We determine where it landed. We make sure that position is still loaded, because there was a bug where this would crash when the server is shutting down, and it detected anvils leaving. Then we determine what block the anvil landed on, and if it was a iron block, then we're going to try and create a printing press form, and if it was a obsidian block, we're going to try the crushing operation. But in this case, when we're trying to create the form, we're spawning these items and they can't be picked up. So if we're trying the form creation, then we determine all of the recipes that can create forms, and for each of the item entities in the area, and then for each of the recipes for each of those items, if it's a valid output of that recipe, we're going to continue. Or rather, if it's not a valid recipe, we're going to go to the next recipe. And we create the form from the reference item, which is the one that was squished by the anvil onto the iron block. We will discard the item that got squished, and we will create a new item that is for the form for the printing press. And what's happening is, when we're adding the entity to the level, it is adding it to the server level, and that is getting into the entity manager where it's being tracked, so that when you're in a chunk, it knows what entities are there. So there's a section storage, and we're getting or creating the section. And what's happening is, if I put a breakpoint here, we can observe that when the code pauses here, we are inside the logic for the anvil leaving. So when we're calling remove, we're setting removed on stuff. So here, inside the persistent entity section manager, when we're removing an entity, we stop tracking it, and in the process of stop tracking it, our handler for the anvil having left is being called. So when we stop tracking, there's the callbacks and then the entity stuff, and then it's posting to the event bus for the entity leaved level event, which is where we are doing our logic. But inside the persistent entity section manager, in here, after our callback has been happened, we are still inside the removal of the original entity. And when in our code we despawn the original entity, that was the last entity in that chunk. And when it gets removed, it's going to remove the section that that entity belonged to. So when we create the new entity, it's going to be added to the same chunk in a new section. However, after our handler finishes running, it's going to remove the section if it's empty. So what's happening is there's the old section and the new section. The anvil fell in here, and we despawned an item that we squished with the anvil. So then there's no entities. And then when we added the new entity for the form item, it goes into a new section. But in the process of the anvil going away is when we despawn the other entity and spawn our entity. And in the finishing process of the anvil going away, because the new entity went into a new section, the old section that the anvil belonged to indicates that it is empty. So when it gets removed, because it corresponds to the same chunk, the key is the same, and it's going to remove the section that our new entity just got added to. So when we look at here, if we run the code to here and step into this, it's going to check if the section is empty, and that evaluates to true, even though in our falling anvil handler, we just spawned the new item entity into the same location. So when the server is checking what entity the player might be standing on to pick up the items, the section information that this item belongs to is no longer in the lookup table. So if we look at how items get picked up, if we look at an item entity, we can find the player touch method. So it only works on the server side. And if we put a breakpoint here, we are hitting this method only on the client. So if we keep playing, every frame the game resumes, this method is never getting called on the server. We're never pausing on this line. And this touch method, we determine what entities the player is touching inside the AI step method. And when we do that, we get the list of entities, which is the level, the entities inside the same level as the player, inside the bounding box of the player. And when we call get entities on the server, it is using the section manager to get the entities inside the level. So inside this method, for each entity in our bounding box, it's going to loop over them and get the entity section. So if we run to here, this section is not working anymore. Like, it's never being called on the server to pick up the item because it's not, the section is not being tracked properly. So to fix that, because the problem is from when in our Anvil handler that we are despawning the item and spawning the new item immediately inside the handler for an item that's already being despawned, we should instead defer our logic to the next tick when we're outside of this event. And that should be fairly straightforward, because after we check if we should actually do anything, but before we do all the entity stuff, we can say level.server execute. On the next available tick, we're going to do our logic. And this will create a runnable object that holds all these references to the position that's relevant. So the Anvil position, even though it's declared outside that runnable, because it's a final value, it's going to be able to be moved into this and execute the next time it's okay to execute something. So by running and applying all those changes, we should be able to see if it works or not. So if we turn off all our breakpoints, it is still failing, which is interesting, because that should only be happening inside here. So if I restore the breakpoints, So this is running inside the tick of a falling block entity? What? This is still inside our event handler. So this execute method, determining whether or not it should run immediately. Let's find out. So it's running the task immediately because it says it should not schedule executables. So I know the root cause. I will figure out a solution. But for now, I thought that was interesting to observe the exact reason that this was failing. And until I actually identified what was going on, it was very bizarre on what the behavior was, because it seemed like it was related to the version number, where it was working on 1.19.2 but not on 1.21.1. So there was trial and error to identify what the actual version was that was causing trouble, and eventually by using the F3C to copy and run the things at the exact same position on the different versions, I was able to identify that, hey, the chunks are actually related to this, and that me being in the chunk or not with the thing that's happening is causing issues. And overall, just a bunch of breakpoint debugging. But that was what I wanted to share. Have a good one. Hey there, just as an extra, I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that the reason that I was having this problem is because I have my own cache instead of using the default block capability cache that's included by Neoforged, which you should be using if your block is the one that's responsible for owning the capabilities. Where in my case, I have this cable network thing that is bringing the logic for caching the capabilities outside of the manager, and it's easier for me to have a custom data structure. But in most cases, like if you have a hopper or something, then you're going to have an easier time just using this block capability cache, because in its creation, it handles making sure that it holds a reference to the listener for you. So using this will just make your life easier, but I just wanted to make sure I mentioned this. Hey there again, I just wanted to clarify my clarification, and really, it's not the fact that I have the cache or the capability being owned by something outside the manager. It's really because in Super Factory Manager, I support several versions of the game at the same time using the same code base. So in the cache for the level, when in 1.20.3, the result of a capability changed from a lazy optional to just being a object reference that can be null, that causes a lot of changes in the code base. So I've created an abstraction on top of all the capabilities so that across the different versions, I just use this class, and this contains all of the version dependent behavior. So between 1.19.2 and 1.21.1, if I look at the cache results, in after 1.20.3, it's holding the raw thing instead of the lazy optional, like I mentioned. And that is why I wasn't using the block capability cache, is trying to reduce the amount of differences between the different Minecraft versions. So really, you probably definitely want to be using the block capability cache from the Neoforge platform. So this one, even if it's not like I could be using it for the cable network stuff here, it's just as things shook out, it ended up that I wasn't. And I ended up hitting this issue because I wasn't holding the thing. So I wanted to clarify that clarification.